the previous module, we discussed the MTSS framework, illustrated by a three-tiered triangle. This graphic comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, also known as the NCTSN, which uses this framework for creating, supporting, and sustaining trauma-informed schools. We'll dive deeper into this framework later when we talk about whole school approaches to addressing the impact of trauma. Today's session is intended to lay the foundation for why these types of whole school, multi-tiered approaches are so needed. For example, Tier 1 emphasizes the importance of creating safety in the environment, which is important for all students and staff, but crucial for those who have experienced traumatic stress. Tier 2 targets the identification and early intervention of students who are at risk of or have been exposed to trauma. And Tier 3 focuses on providing intensive, trauma-specific supports to students and their families. As a place to start, let's define what trauma is. A widely accepted definition of trauma can be broken down into the 3 E's. First, an individual experiences a painful or distressing event. There are a wide range of types of events that individuals can experience, which we will talk about shortly. However, the event alone is not enough to meet the definition of trauma. For the second E, the individual will experience an intense and prolonged stress response as a result of the event. They may feel terrified during the event, and the stress response continues long after the event has ended. It is important to note that different individuals will have different responses to the same events, and also that all individuals will not experience the same events as trauma. Some people will be more resilient than others in response to the same experiences. Finally, the event and the individual's experience of the event produces effects, the third E, that last beyond the immediate aftermath. It is very common for someone to experience an acute distress response in the first 2 to 3 months after something stressful or frightening occurs, and these symptoms often go away with adequate support and time. However, physical and emotional symptoms that last beyond that period are signs that this person is experiencing ongoing distress and may need additional support. We will talk more about what these signs look like, especially in the school setting, in future modules. As stated earlier, a traumatic event can take many different forms. It can be a single event, like a serious accident or injury, or it can be a chronic experience, such as ongoing physical abuse or neglect. It can be a traumatic event that one directly experiences, but can also occur when one witnesses or is exposed to the event, such as have seen it occur, seeing graphic images of it, or being told about it. This is significant when considering secondary traumatic stress, the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another, which we will discuss at greater length in a later learning session. Traumatic events can be natural in origin, such as floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes, or they can be man-made disasters, such as war, school shootings, and bombing attacks. Trauma can occur in the context of communities, such as a natural disaster that affects an entire community. Some community-level traumatic events, such as community violence. Trauma can also occur in the context of more intimate relationships, such as experiencing domestic violence. We invite you to think about what types of trauma youth experience in your community, in their homes, or in school. They can include things like assault, experiencing racism, or living through a tornado. In addition, your students may have experienced trauma related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The prevalence of exposure to potentially traumatic events is startling. More than 2/3 of children and youth in a nationally representative sample reported at least one potentially traumatic event by age 16. This included events such as exposure to interpersonal violence, accidents, disasters, life-threatening illnesses, and the unexpected death of a loved one. Moreover, African American and Hispanic youth report significantly higher rates of witnessing violence and violence relative to their Caucasian counterparts, regardless of income. It is important to remember that exposure is not enough to cause significant impairment over time. Remember the 3 E's we discussed earlier. In the first study, although more than 2/3 of children experience a potentially traumatic event, only 13.4% of those exposed to a potentially traumatic event showed symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress. However, those that were exposed to multiple traumas or had experienced other types of family adversity or had pre-existing anxiety symptoms were the ones most likely to show that third E, those long-lasting effects. Now think about what this means in your classroom. Let's say you have a classroom of 30 students. That means that approximately 20 of them have been or will be exposed to a traumatic event by the time they turn 16 years old. Take a few moments to reflect on the following questions. How aware are you about the types of traumatic events your students may have been exposed to? And how aware are you of the prevalence and impact of trauma among students in your school? So, if we know the impact of trauma on the brain and on teaching and learning, what can we do? We want to emphasize that there is hope. As educators, your mission is to help children grow and learn. You know that brains learn and change and recover, and we can promote healthier development for children who have had adversity or traumatic experiences in their lives. We can build on the strengths that our students, their families, their schools, and their communities possess in order to promote the wellness of all. Resilience is sometimes described as the capacity to bounce back from difficult situations. In the case of the bouncing ball, the image of the ball represents the person, and the impact of the ball on the ground represents the stressful experience. When we are feeling like a ball, we may be capable of bouncing back. However, we don't always feel like a ball. Sometimes we feel more like an egg. We need support around us to cushion the blow and give us the opportunity to deal with the impact of the stressor. We hope that you and your school will be that cushion for your students. As you'll hear more about in a future module, youth and family partnerships can inform what types of programs and supports you put into place to support resilience and build on existing youth, family, and community strengths. Many of you may have heard of the ACE study. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Because of the ACE study, we now understand more about the long-term effects that potentially traumatic experiences can have on the mental and physical health of individuals over the course of the lifespan. The following video summarizes the key points of this groundbreaking study and a follow-up study conducted in Philadelphia in 2012. Let's watch this video together.
In the mid-90s, Doctors Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda published groundbreaking research assessing the links between childhood adversity and adult health and well-being. In the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, known as the ACE study, 17,000 mostly white, mostly middle-class adults were asked about 10 different types of childhood adversity. When you were a child, were you physically or psychologically abused by parents? Did you live with someone who abused drugs? Were you neglected? Was there domestic violence? Did anyone go to prison? Was someone in your home mentally ill? Respondents were assigned one ACE for each of the 10 types of adversity experienced. Surprisingly, more than 1 in 5 of this mostly middle-class population reported 3 or more ACEs. But even more eye-opening was the correlation between childhood adversity and adult mental and physical health.
The higher the ACE score, the more likely people were to suffer from things like heart disease, liver disease, lung disease, depression, suicide, IV drug abuse, and alcoholism. What it said was, we've got a common causality for all of our major health and social problems. And it was all related to what had happened to them as children.
But researchers like Dr. Roy Wade could see the ACE study didn't take into account economic distress, let alone hunger, housing insecurity, and other hardships in low-income neighborhoods.
When I came to Philadelphia and I saw the huge amount of blight, the community violence, the episodes of racism and discrimination, those are stressors too.
When Philadelphia researchers expanded the ACE survey to add questions about racism, neighborhood safety, and violence outside the home, they discovered that while 14% of the general population reported 4 or more ACEs, in Philadelphia, that number was a startling 37%.
Poverty is an adverse childhood experience that gets under the skin. Living in economic distress can actually translate into long-term negative health outcomes, even for the most resilient individuals.
Now that we've watched that video, I'd like to highlight some key findings from the ACE study. First of all, ACEs are more common than realized. And also, ACEs go together. ACEs are powerfully predictive of both adult mental and physical health outcomes. And the effect of ACEs remains strong in many different populations. We invite you to reflect on your personal experience of ACEs and the effect of ACEs on students at your school. Now let's take a look at this image. Adverse experiences occur at the family, community, and structural or systems level. Our capacity and choice to effectively intervene toward healing can only be as great as our understanding of the multifaceted and multi-layered impacts of trauma and adversity. We invite you to pause and reflect on this expanded view of ACEs that is inclusive of historical and present-day manifestations of racism and discrimination. The original study examined ACEs that occur within the context of individual families. Those are labeled here as adverse childhood experiences and are represented by the leaves and branches of the tree. The Philadelphia study expanded that perspective to include additional community-level adversities, and in this image, those adversities are labeled as adverse community environments and include exposure to poverty, racism and discrimination, community violence, and the lack of educational or economic opportunity. Notice how this image shows those as the roots of the adverse childhood experiences. What is often overlooked are those adverse collective historical experiences that create the soil that surrounds this ACEs tree. Poverty and other adverse community conditions are not equitably distributed in our society. Disinvestment and lack of equitable opportunities are more likely to characterize racially segregated communities. It is in this broader context, which includes adverse community environments and adverse collective historical experiences, that ACEs can be most accurately understood. So what is the connection between ACEs and mental and physical health in adulthood? This is the theoretical model now proposed by the authors of the original ACE study. The pyramid offers an explanation for how ACEs influence child development and impact adulthood outcomes. The pyramid represents the theoretical explanation of how ACEs and outcomes go together. Consider this pyramid with the base representing early life events and at the tip top representing the end of your life. In this model, generational and social conditions such as institutional racism and other forms of oppression can contribute to the presence of early adverse experiences that can actually change how the brain develops, which in turn impairs social, emotional, and cognitive development. At this stage, children might be struggling in school, academically, behaviorally, socially, which is where you see them. As the child develops, they may adopt risky health behaviors such as drug and alcohol use, smoking, unhealthy eating, and sexually risky behaviors to cope with stressors. This can lead to disease, disability, and/or social problems, which could lead to an early death. But this is a pyramid shape because only a subgroup of people with adverse experiences will go on to experience the next level of negative outcomes and so on up the pyramid. Exposure to ACEs does not mean that you are definitely going to die at an early age, or even that you will experience any of the other levels of the pyramid. There are many factors, such as interventions by caring adults, positive coping skills, or personality traits that allow children to adapt and cope with stress. Importantly, this means that there are things we can do as educators and school staff to improve outcomes, including intervening at the social, emotional, and cognitive levels with students in our schools and districts. Dr. Robert Anda, one of the original ACE study researchers, has said, "What is predictable is preventable." We can have a profound impact on the life outcomes of the students with whom we work. It is important to note that the adverse childhood experiences and trauma are not the same thing. Having an adverse experience, like living in poverty or having an incarcerated parent, does not mean that the individual has been traumatized. Many people live with adversity without developing any subsequent symptoms. ACEs and trauma are related, however, to the extent that the accumulation of events, including adversity, can make it increasingly more challenging to cope. Now let's take a look at what happens in the brain. The top part, or cortical regions of the brain, also known as the thinking brain, are comprised of several lobes, each contributing to the integration of conceptual thought and the five senses. The cortical region that is the last to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the executive functions of attention, concentration, organization, analysis, and planning. Trauma inhibits the development and functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Students who have been exposed to trauma may experience reduced ability to pay attention, concentrate on school assignments, organize their work, problem solve, and develop study skills. They may appear impulsive and become easily frustrated. In fact, Broca's area, which is responsible for speech production, completely shuts down during times of traumatic stress or reminders, making it impossible for the student to talk about what's upsetting them in the moment. So you might see a student who is easily frustrated and impulsive and unable to adequately express this frustration. This dysregulation can be misunderstood as willful oppositional behavior and can, if not de-escalated, lead to classroom disruption or even dangerous behaviors. Behavioral manifestations will be explored later in the module that focuses on signs of trauma in schools. Our emotions are processed subcortically in the limbic system, also known as the emotional brain, and under ordinary circumstances are integrated into the cortex through neural circuits. When the body perceives stress, the amygdala acts like the brain's fire alarm, signaling the hypothalamus to release the stress hormones of adrenaline and cortisol. The release of stress hormones prompts the sympathetic nervous system to increase respiration, heart rate, and perspiration to prepare the body for fight, flight, freeze. Regarding the freeze response, the person becomes immobilized, but the sympathetic nervous system is still activated. There's a lot going on under the surface. Finally, memories of the experience are stored in the body's file cabinet, the hippocampus. During traumatic events, however, the files can become jumbled or incomplete, so there might be memory gaps or inaccurate recall of place and time. With this process in mind, let's take a look at the stress response system and how it relates to traumatic stress. When a scary or dangerous event occurs, our bodies have a helpful adaptive capacity to protect us by sending an alarm signal from the amygdala, which cause stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol to be released in our bodies. And this puts us in top physical capacity to respond to the situation by fighting, fleeing, or freezing. This all happens very quickly and automatically so that our bodies are prepared to act in these situations without a delay. A memory of the event is stored in the hippocampus so that we are more prepared the next time we encounter this dangerous situation, and then our bodies return to their relaxed state. This adaptive response system allows us to act quickly in dangerous situations in order to protect ourselves. However, traumatic stress can cause the same sort of fight, flight, or freeze response, not only in response to scary or dangerous situations, but also when there's only a reminder of the scary or dangerous event. This is sometimes called a trigger. The same stress hormones are released in response to the amygdala, sensing danger, and our bodies react as though we were actually in the situation again and not merely being reminded of it. For children with histories of trauma, the stress response can last much longer. These children's bodies take longer to return to baseline functioning after they realize it was a false alarm. Cortisol and adrenaline continue to flow through their bodies for a longer period of time, interfering with normal cognitive and physical processes. This is significant in the context of schools because a student who has been triggered may feel on edge, irritable, and anxious, and have difficulty engaging in typical developmental tasks like learning or play. They may seem to be overreacting to a small incident and not be able to concentrate on their history lesson, for example. This student might have to take time to go to the calm corner in the classroom and stay there until their body is calm enough to return to the lesson. There are two components of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system controls the fight, flight, freeze response, and the parasympathetic nervous system controls the regulation and restabilization of bodily functions. Activating this part of the nervous system can help regulate traumatic stress responses. Therefore, activating the parasympathetic nervous system is crucial for learning because it helps re-engage the thinking brain. There are many ways to build resilience in this way. Physical activations such as progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness activities like intentionally tracking one's thoughts, and other actions that help promote regulation activate the parasympathetic nervous system and can help switch off the fight, flight, freeze response in the brain and cortisol and control the activation of stress hormones. Resilience can be strengthened in children experiencing traumatic stress through teaching of these skills. Keep in mind, these activities that activate the parasympathetic nervous system when we discuss secondary traumatic stress and the promotion of wellness in future modules. Some of the effects on brain development and learning are displayed here. Research has demonstrated that exposure to traumatic events lowers IQ, reading ability, and grade point averages of students. It also increases the likelihood of absenteeism, behavior problems, suspensions, and expulsion of students, and leads to decreased rates of high school graduation. These are all outcomes that schools are trying to improve. Our schools must attend to these effects of trauma on youth to be able to help students be successful and realize their potential. Although this is a foundational exploration of trauma as educators, you are interested in how trauma is manifested emotionally, behaviorally in learning and in social interactions. For example, a student who has experienced trauma could have emotional outbursts in class, but they might react aggressively towards their peers, have difficulty concentrating and retaining important information, and have difficulties making and keeping friends. In future modules, the emotional, behavioral, learning, and social manifestations of trauma will be presented in greater detail. In future modules, we will also be discussing various classroom strategies to effectively support students who are affected by traumatic stress. We invite you to take a few moments to reflect on the following. Why is it important that our school community understands trauma and adversity?